Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. It's been a while since my last video, and as you can probably see, I'm in a pretty different setting to the last one because I've just come back to Australia. Since I've just come back to Australia, I thought it would be a good opportunity to talk a bit about Australian English. A lot of English learners ask me about Australian English. They ask, is it similar to British English? Is it similar to American English? So I thought I would take this chance to explain some of the differences between Australian, British, and American English, and to tell you a bit about how you can sound more Australian. This video is going to cover the differences in pronunciation, a little bit about grammar, and the differences in vocabulary and slang. Pronunciation. One of the biggest differences between Australian English and other varieties of English is in the pronunciation. Overall, Australian English is more similar to British English in pronunciation. I would describe it as sort of a lazy or kind of a drunk British pronunciation. And while most aspects are similar to British, there are a few aspects where Australian is more similar to American English. Before we begin, I don't have a very strong Australian accent. My accent's not very pronounced, so it might be hard to hear some of the differences when I speak normally. But if you listen to somebody with a really strong, a really pronounced, broad Australian accent, you'll be able to hear these differences really easily.
Well, mate, we're going to start with a couple of smaller animals and work our way up into some legendary animals.
You really are Australian, aren't you?
I don't know, mate. I can't help it. I was born there.
First, Australian English, just like British English, is non-rhotic. So this means we don't pronounce R's at the end of syllables or at the end of words. So for example, a word like car, in my accent, you can't hear the R at all. Whereas in American English, it would be a bit more like car. Now, while the R pronunciation is more similar to British English, our pronunciation of T's in the middle of words is more similar to American English. So in British English, a word like little has a very strong T in the middle of it. Whereas in Australian English and American English, that T is pronounced more like a R. So the word little in British English would be pronounced like little in Australian or in American English. When you combine this flapped T and the pronunciation of R at the end of a word, you get some words which are pronounced differently in America, Australia, and Britain. One really good example of this is this word. In Britain, they'd pronounce it as water with a strong T and no R at the end. In America, they would pronounce it as water, so with a flap T and with an R at the end. And in Australia, we'd say there's water, with a flap T and no R at the end. Another small difference between Australian and American English is that T's at the start of words often get pronounced more like a ch sound in Australian English. So for example, the word Tuesday in my accent sounds more like Tuesday, whereas in an American pronunciation, it might be more like Tuesday or Tuesday. Now, all of the things I've mentioned so far are small differences and similarities between Australian, American, and British English, but the real distinguishing feature of Australian English, the thing that really makes it unique, is the pronunciation of vowels. In particular, it's the pronunciation of diphthongs, which are vowels that move around as you say them. I'm going to go through a few of the really important diphthongs, and if you master these, it'll get your accent sounding really Australian. First is the A vowel in words like face or tape. In a lot of American accents, this diphthong moves from an E to E, so it sounds like A. You'll get a word like face, tape. In Australian accents, instead of starting from E, it starts from A. So instead of getting A, you have A. This means instead of the word face, you get face. A, face, face. The next diphthong is the O in goat. In many American accents, this diphthong starts as an and moves to U, so you get O and goat. In Australian accents, instead of starting as an it starts more like an R. So instead of O, you get O. This means instead of pronouncing as goat, you get goat. O, goat, goat. The next diphthong is the I vowel in price. In many American accents, this will start as an A and move to E, so you have I. Price. In many Australian accents, instead of starting as A, it starts as O. So instead of I, you get I. This means instead of price, you get price. I. Price, price. Finally, we have the diphthong ow in mouth. In many accents outside Australia, this vowel starts as an A and moves to U, so ow, mouth. But in some very strong Australian accents, you can hear it starting from more like an A. So A, U, ow. Mouth. Ow. Ow. Mouth. Mouth. There are other elements of pronunciation we can talk about, but these are the really big distinguishing features of Australian English that make it unique. Grammar. Next, I'm going to talk about some small grammatical differences between Australian and American English. I say it between Australian and American English because Australian and British English line up almost perfectly when it comes to grammar. The main differences are differences in spelling, and again, Australia always lines up with Britain when it comes to spelling. For example, any words ending in "-ize" are spelled I-Z-E or Y-Z-E in America, but are spelled I-S-E or Y-S-E in Australia and Britain. Words like colour are spelled with O-R in America and with O-U-R in Australia and Britain. Words like analog are spelt with OG in America and OGUE in Australia and Britain. Words like centre are spelt ER in America and RE in Australia and Britain. Words like defence are spelt ENSE in America and ENCE in Australia and Britain. Another small difference in grammar is the punctuation. So in Australian or British English, if your quotation ends in a full stop or a comma, that full stop or comma goes inside the quotation marks. But in America, that goes outside the quotation marks. Finally, there are some small differences in how verbs are conjugated. For example, Australians say got, but Americans say gotten. And Australians spell learnt with a T at the end, whereas Americans spell it with ED. But apart from that, the grammar is pretty much identical between Australian English and other varieties. Vocabulary. And to finish off, a really big difference between Australian English and other varieties is the vocabulary. Now, in some cases, Australian English follows the vocabulary of British English. In other cases, we follow the vocabulary of American English. And in some other cases, we use a completely different word as well. Here are a few examples where Australia uses more American words than British. First, these in Britain would be called trousers, whereas in America, they would be called pants. You can use both words in Australia, but we're probably more likely to say pants. On the flip side, these would be called pants in Britain, but would be called underwear in America. And in Australia, we'd use the word underwear as well. In other cases, Australia follows the British words. So for example, these in America would be called fries, but in Britain would be called chips, and in Australia, we'd also call them chips. This in America would be called an elevator, but in Britain would be called a lift, and in Australia would be called a lift as well. This would be called a stroller in America, but would be called a pram in Britain, and we'd also call it a pram. And there are a few words that are completely unique to Australia. So this would be called a pickup truck in the US, and I think also in Britain, but in Australia we'd call it a ute. These are called flip-flops in other countries, but in Australia they're called thongs. This is called a pavement in Britain, it's called a sidewalk in the US, and it's called the footpath in Australia. And finally, one of the most distinguishing features of Australian English is the slang. In particular, Australians use a lot of diminutives. So we'd say Christmas is Chrissy, breakfast is brekkie, afternoon is arvo, barbecue is barbie. Other examples include snag, which is a sausage, or sanger, which is a sandwich. These are just the words that I could think of off the top of my head. So if you can think of any more, feel free to put them in the comments below. I hope this video was useful for everybody, and I hope it cleared up some of the differences between Australian English and other varieties. If you have any questions about Australian English or language learning in general, feel free to leave them in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.